Howdy guys, I hope you're all doing well today. I recently received a question regarding my understanding of women in ministry, specifically from 1 Timothy chapter 2. And I thought this would be a great topic to share with everyone because there's no way that's controversial. Or is it? It's quite a controversial topic depending on who you ask. So before the axes and the hatchets start to fly, I figure if I dress appropriately, I could not possibly offend anybody. Now, largely, I want to pull from research by Gary Hogue, who did his PhD dissertation on this very topic. And there is a lot of cultural dynamic here. It helps if one were to study ancient Greek material from that era, because sometimes it helps us to get a grip on what's actually being said in the New Testament documents, to put into context what Paul is saying. And I don't actually mean we need to overly contextualize everything per se, as if Paul's words only apply to people back then in the context of living in the first century. We have to be careful with that, because that can become a slippery slope in which folks start writing off everything Paul said to cultural context. I mean, you see it today, don't you, with things like sexual ethics and so many different topics. But nevertheless, cultural context does help us in some situations. Now, it's not like we're all going to be studying ancient Greek literature alongside the Bible, but it is interesting to listen to folks who have. And Hogue began studying something called the Ecclesiaca, which was thought to be a 2nd century novel by a writer named Xenophon of Ephesus. And it was found around the 1700s, but since then, they've changed the dating on it. Originally, they thought it was from the 2nd century, so New Testament scholars didn't really pay much attention. But in 1996, it was discovered that the Ecclesiaca, the text actually dated earlier than they previously thought, back to around 50 AD. And that puts it smack dab in the time frame that Paul would have written these passages about women in the New Testament. In fact, Paul would have actually been centered in Ephesus at that exact time, from around 50 to 54 AD. So if we use a methodology of sort of overlaying what's going on socially there in Ephesus from an outside source, we can look into the lifestyle of the people to whom Paul is addressing and with whom he is interacting. Now first, let me just read one of these passages to give it to you in full context. Okay, 1 Timothy chapter 2, and I'll be reading verses 9 through 15. And Paul writes, I also want women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, not with plaited, braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. All right, lot to process there. So just slow down before you get angry, okay? It's a complex passage that's used to talk quite often about the role of women in ministry. Now see, for me, although I don't think of myself as a misogynist, I'm not anti-woman. The first person I ever ordained was a woman. But my problem was with just flippantly writing off this verse to cultural context because of the fact that Paul is appealing to Adam and Eve as his example. And if Adam and Eve are the blueprint, then there's something universal here that transcends every age and culture. But nevertheless, when you look at these external Greek writings of what was going on culturally in Ephesus, it starts to paint this passage in an entirely different light than what many have pictured in fundamental evangelical churches. This plaited hairstyle that Paul talks about with the gold and the pearls, you know, there is nothing wrong with decking it out at the salon. But in the writing of Xenophon, you see that this exact same type of hairstyle is prominently used by women in Ephesus to show their piety to the goddess Artemis. So on the one hand, Paul is saying to show their piety to God, not with these elaborate externals like the pagans, but with good deeds. Nothing wrong with a nice kufur, but as an act of worship, it is pointless. Rather, instead, he's saying, live the gospel. Also, in that context, women in Ephesus would have learned through reciting prayers out loud in public speaking, speaking out incantations and chants out loud in the streets so that people from around the world who came to the Artemisium to hear stories of Artemis, who was the mother of all life, they would listen to these women who learned how the origin of the world came into being through Artemis. And out of all the 7 wonders of the world back in those days, number 2 on the list was the Artemisium. So we're talking the place was a virtual Disneyland with a massive temple. People would come from all over the place to pay respects to the mother of all life. So when looking at the text, what may really be happening, you have these young women who are trained from childhood to promote the Artemis myth. The Artemis-Diana myth promoted the idea that it was not through woman, but through man that sin entered the world. And so Paul is saying that in the church, we don't continue to promote this Artemis myth. So Paul is not trying to bash Eve here. He's just countering that seesaw because of the pagan idea of the day was elevating women over men. Also, people who wrestle with these passages in terms of women in ministry, they have trouble at the end with the part about women being saved through childbearing. Well, what's that about? Well, in Greek mythology, Artemis helped her mother Leto to deliver her twin brother Apollo. So she became the goddess of childbearing. So there was this superstitious social pressure. If you didn't remain loyal to the goddess, you would die through childbearing. And so look, there is actually a beauty in this text. If you don't just write it off because it doesn't seem culturally appropriate, but you wrestle through the text and you wait with it and you sit on it, man, you begin to see something. Paul is saying point blank to young women in the Ephesian context. He's like, look, you don't have to dress like the goddess. Show your loyalty authentically from the inside out to the true creator of the universe. And also, I don't permit ladies with this pagan background to come in loud-mouthing these chants and trying to teach. And by the way, the term authority over man is actually better translated author of man. I don't let them teach that woman is the author of man, because actually Adam was created first and then Eve. So see, he's not really talking about authority, he's talking about origin. It's helping them view a proper origin of where sin came from, and they do not have to fear dying through childbirth, but they will be preserved through childbearing as they walk in faith, love, holiness, and modesty. He's not saying you'll be saved by bearing kids, he's saying you'll be saved in childbearing. You're not going to die. You don't need to be superstitious here. So enough on that. I'm not going to break down every single passage, but hopefully you see how this fresh evidence from other contextual sources helps us to shed light on some of these difficult passages. But in affirming the biblicity of women to be able to lead and teach, please do not think that I'm confused about Pauline doctrine regarding marital roles. I strongly affirm a man's leadership in his household, which is highly unpopular role to advocate in today's society. But I want to talk about this because I have something for the men in here as well. Now, I am not talking about control. The overflow of God's love and spirit in our lives should lend us to loving deference toward one another. But let's look at what Paul actually tells us in Ephesians regarding marriage. Okay, a little different topic than women in ministry, but this is still related. He says in Ephesians 5, verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Okay? Now, before we dive into all this, I want you to notice how Paul's moral admonitions that he begins to get into in Ephesians, they are all beginning and rooted right here in the heart of the family. Family is the cornerstone of society. Healthy families produce a healthy society, and healthy families are built ultimately on the love between a man and a woman, and that is built upon the recognition of God's love for us, Christ's love for the church. Notice, Paul does not say that the husband and wife are like Christ in the church. He alerts you to a mystery here. He says this is Christ in the church. And as I've stated before, that one of the reasons we have such a high divorce rate is because we have viewed marriage as a covenant. A covenant is a legal agreement between two parties. And if that's all it is, then marriage is bound to fail, at least on the inside. But listen, marriage is not merely a covenant. Marriage is a sacrament. A sacrament is a visible, tangible representation of the grace of God. Just like communion is a sacrament, not just a symbol. Jesus didn't say this is a symbol of my body. There's a mystery, something mystical here. He says this is my body, okay? And in marriage, the two become one. And yet there is still distinction in unity. In the same way that you are completely united to Christ, but as John Calvin said, you are united to him far closer than a husband and wife ever could be. And yet there is still distinction within that unity. You're united to God, but you are not God, okay? Jesus is one with the Father, and yet he is distinct from the Father. And even within the Trinity, you see this mutual submission to one another and this unity and distinction. But Jesus is in no way less than the Father. Not even one iota, even in his role. Absolutely not. So don't be one of those twits who confuse marriage or the Trinity to be some sort of hierarchy. But marriage is about mutual submission, just as Paul earlier said to all of us to submit to one another. But this goes much more deeply and more intimately with marriage. Of course, these verses have been used to justify domineering, controlling, abusive husbandry. But there is a mutual submission here. Christ in his incarnation and in his condescension into our fallen human flesh did far more to submit himself to you and I than we ever were able to conjure up any submission to him. So don't think husbands do not serve their wives here. Does the man carry a role of leadership in the home? Absolutely. Does his role indicate that he is more valuable, more worthy, more superior, blah, blah, blah? Give me a break. A role is nothing more than a role. It says nothing about your IQ, your virtue, your talent, etc. It means you were born with a penis. But nevertheless, God put it there, which means you have a certain calling in life. If all of our discussion about gender and sexuality were that easy, you just look down and see what's there, it would be a much simpler world, wouldn't it? But I digress. And if a man is not loving and providing and caring for his household, he dishonors that role and shows himself unworthy of it. There is a mutual submission here, and that a man must not live for himself, but give himself completely over to his bride. There is neither male nor female in Christ when it comes to worth or standing in God's eyes, etc. But to deny that there are exquisite differences between the sexes is to reject biological fact. We can't fight against science here. Look, there is an inherent aggression and drive to conquer and lead within the male species. I mean, good God, anybody with children knows that little boys bounce off the wall, shooting and killing everything with their plastic guns if they're allowed to have them. I mean, that's why this neutering educational system today wants to slap the label of ADD on all boys and sedate them with Ritalin. It's why the Christian book market puts freaking pastel pink angels and flowers on all the covers of their books, because their #1 target audience is middle-aged women. By and large, there are far more women in church than men statistically, because although the majority of leaders are male, most of them lack cojones, and guys recognize that. And there's all this floral sentimentality and soft-stepping and emotionalism, and I'm not even going to go into the depths to describe it today, but any man who's listening knows the church, it becomes this neutered sort of thing. And part of the problem is this: where are the fathers? No one's teaching boys how to grow up and be men. And we wonder why we live in such a politically correct, sissified society where all the boys dress in American Apparel tights like little girls and nobody takes any risks. And I don't mean we've got to be cavemen and eat gunpowder, but come on. Everything is so sanitized and cellophane wrapped for us today in the church and in the world. Where is this raw ruggedness that's missing? I mean, even hipster culture tries to imitate it. I mean, you see the metrosexual has turned into a lumbersexual these days. The hipster thing is to wear the beard and the flannel, etc. But this is fake manicured manhood sort of thing, where manhood is this museum relic where we pretend to be what men used to be. It's like make-believe manhood. Instead of killing a deer and gutting it with your hands, you buy a plastic deer head at Urban Outfitters. But look, this thing goes really broad, guys. It is an interesting time with social media as well, because you're never going to get some guy with real chutzpah to be in any leadership positions. All your photos and every decision you ever made since you were 12 years old is posted somewhere online, and the media digs that crap up. So the only guy who's ever going to make political office or CEO in some company in the world or in the church is the guy who knows how to market himself and polish apples, whereas you may have a guy who, sure, he tried an orgy or smoked PCP once in college, but at least he's a guy who was willing to take risk, and despite the mistakes he's made, he's got a set of testes and he's willing to try something new. We need leaders who take risks, who pioneer, who aren't subservient to popular opinion when tough decisions need to be made. But don't get me started on the lack of masculinity in the church. I find it refreshing that we see as many or maybe even more dudes in our meetings these days as we do women now, and that's not the norm in the church. But look, femininity is also under attack. I mean, God forbid that a woman doesn't want to go to college and have a career as a microbiologist, but actually wants to stay home and raise kids while her husband works. I mean, God forbid she actually wants to be taken care of while she nurtures a family and doesn't see that as a lesser calling. But to even say a statement like that, someone's going to accuse me of being a chauvinist, as if I think all women should be barefoot and pregnant at home. Look, tons of women are called to career. My own daughter is going to college as a biochemist. I am not knocking, nor do I not appreciate the healthy advances that feminism has brought to our society. All I'm saying is that one is not better than the other. And we all know there's this hyper version of feminism out there that really just hates men, or trying to be like men as if their own femininity is bad. In the same way that male chauvinism objectifies women, that hyper femininity is a self-righteous aberration. See, when Paul discusses this stuff regarding roles, he's not appealing to societal norms of what's politically correct. So we can't just say Paul's being a chauvinist because that was his culture. No, he's appealing to the creation narrative in Genesis, where a man leaves his father and mother, is united with a woman, and the two become one flesh. In fact, this notion of Christianity as being chauvinist is the furthest thing from the truth. It is actually the #1 belief system ever on planet Earth that has advanced and empowered women's role in society more than any religion or worldview on the planet. I mean, look at the oppression that so many other world religions have hoisted upon women to this very day. Do you know women's suffrage, the ability for women to vote, was actually part of a revival movement in the church? But then it turned ugly and legalistic and married up with prohibition to take our booze away, but that's another subject altogether. Look, part of the reason our modern society would have with male leadership in the home is simply due to a poor understanding of godly leadership itself. In this kingdom, true leadership is defined as servant leadership. It fosters freedom. Its authority is not found in an iron fist or trying to draw everybody to yourself and your own vision, but it is rooted in love and getting underneath others and releasing them into their vision. Fathering, mothering. There has never been an excuse for abuse. Look, Jesus won the world by laying down his own life. He did not demand control. He let go of everything and won absolute control by capturing our hearts, winning our obedience from the inside out. But as much as I will argue that men should be allowed to be men, I will harp also on how society tries to domesticate them and emasculate them. At the same time, I will say that if dudes are not fulfilling their roles of loving and serving their wives the way Christ loves and serves the church, then they're not really men. They are sissies. And if that sounds too much like Mark Driscoll for you, I really don't care. If you're sitting on your tail on Xbox all day long, smoking pot and not being proactive to provide for your family, you have no ambition to step it up and move ahead in life. I'm telling you, financially, emotionally, you are not a man in my book. You're still a little boy. And if you're some religious control freak, expecting your wife to pop out 20 kids and refusing birth control and making her homeschool them all day long when she doesn't want to, you need to get a grip and realize what a prick you are. And if you're single and you want a wife and don't have one, I mean, try getting a job, try advancing at it, try taking night classes, do something that would prepare you for the responsibility of a family, okay? We have a problem today of delayed adolescence in our society. And I know that sounds like some religious guy harping, but I'm telling you what, in earlier times, men had launched careers, sailed around the world, invented breakthroughs in science and mechanics by their late teens. These days, you got a bunch of Peter Pans in their late 20s who are still trying to figure out what they're going to be when they grow up. And I know this is from a lack of fathering, but men, grow up and be men. Stop waiting for some psychotherapist to come and kiss your daddy wounds, okay? You got to dig in, make some decisions, and start thinking outside of yourself and start helping other people. That's what being a man is all about. That's what responsibility is, serving and doing what needs to be done for others. But look, bringing this thing back practically to the text. If women serve their husbands like the church should serve Christ, and if men loved their wives the way that Christ loves the church, this would radically revolutionize marriages and eventually society. Okay, look, I think I have probably offended enough people today, but look, if you want to see women gone wild in ministry, my wife is doing a ladies retreat with Benny Johnson and Melissa Wood, April 28th through 30th in Santa Barbara, California. Now, I do permit her to speak to men as well, but you can find it at thesweetretreat.info. Also, the very next weekend, I'm going to be in Redlands, California, May 5th and 6th for a Supernatural Grace Seminar. It's my only Southern Californian event for the entire year. Find it at thenewmystics.com/CA. And if you're on the East Coast in April, hit us up in Newport News, Virginia for John Crowder Naked, where I'll be sharing lots of personal stories, testimonies, and unusual crazy stuff I normally never talk about, all packed with gospel drunken glory goodness. It is April 21st through the 23rd. You can register at thenewmystics.com/naked. In May is our Cosmic Canadian Tour. That's right, Canada. We are coming to 3 cities across Canada: Toronto, Edmonton, and Abbotsford. This is pre-registration only, so make sure to lock in a spot while you can at thenewmystics.com/CAN. Oh, and look who's going to be joining me in Canada. It's worship leader Tim Wright.
coming to Canada in May, the Cosmic Canadian Tour to Toronto, Edmonton, Abbotsford, thenewmystics.com/can.
Hey, and before you go, listen, I have only 2 mystical schools coming to the USA this year. I'll be in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in June, and I'll be in Pepperell, Massachusetts in October. You can find those at thenewmystics.com/schools. And I also have a mystical school coming to Hanau, Germany in September, as well as a special Holy Ghost party blowout event called Joy Unspeakable near Cologne, Germany. And right now is the only time you've got, if you got a window here to make plans to get outside your little bubbles and take the plunge with me on the mission field with my team as we go to 2 nations on one trip later this year to Hong Kong and the Philippines. I'm telling you, you got a window right now because these things always fill up, okay? We're gonna hit the garbage dumps, the red light districts. We're gonna launch a brand new orphanage that we're building this year with your support. And if you don't have faith to go, but you wanna go, at least have faith to get your application and deposit in, and the Lord will hook you up with His faith for the rest of it, okay? Go to thenewmystics.com/go. And guys, we got quite a number of other events on the calendar. I'm not even gonna mention them all. We're coming to Texas. We're coming to Tampa, Florida. We're coming to Montana. We're coming to Redding, California. You could even intern with me and come to Russia, Mongolia, Armenia, Hungary this summer. Our entire year schedule is available at thenewmystics.com/schools. And check out our brand new issue of the Ecstatic Magazine, in which you can read all the fresh articles we have out there right now for free at thenewmystics.com/ecstatic. You can also read the Ecstatic on our New Mystics iPhone or Android app. See you on the road.
Sons of Thunder runs on partnerships and generous contributions from people like you. If you've been blessed by the ministry and want to participate in sharing the gospel and reaching the poor with us, consider becoming a monthly supporter at thenewmystics.com/partners.